The new Ontario PC government has made a lot of 180-degree turns from the education policies introduced by the previous Liberal government. Whether it's the sex ed curriculum, new university campuses in the 905 now cancelled, or how to teach math, Premier Doug Ford seems intent on taking things in a very different direction. Could there be more in the offing? And if so, should a voucher program for the province's education system be under consideration? Let's get into that with Barb Bierman. She's Executive Director of the Ontario Federation of Independent Schools. Annie Kidder, Executive Director for People for Education. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Liberal Arts, the Law and Society Program at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Ray Pennings from the self-described nonpartisan faith-based think tank Cardus. Good to have all of you around our table again. I just saw you not too long ago, so thanks for taking my call again. And you two on the ends, we haven't seen you here before. Barb, you were here a long time ago.
It's been a while.
Thanks for making the drive from Cambridge for us. Why don't you start us off by just giving us your most basic understanding and definition of how a voucher system might work.
Okay, so our voucher system really puts the power in the hands of the parents. And the money that is designated for education then would follow the parents to the school of their choice, whatever would best suit the child, the student, or the family.
Basically, the voucher represents an amount of money, is that right?
Yes.
And you can either choose to spend that money, as 95% of parents do, in the public education system, or you could take it somewhere else.
That's correct.
In the independent system.
Yeah. Yes.
They do this elsewhere in the world.
Yes.
What's the practice once you bring in a voucher system?
Sorry, how do you mean?
I mean, in terms of where parents choose to send their children once they have the choice.
Well, as you already said, most parents choose to keep their kids in publicly funded schools, and some parents, particularly parents who have students with special needs, learning disabilities, other kinds of special needs, may look for some alternative. They may be looking for an alternative learning style, an alternative pedagogy. Whatever they're looking for, they're free then, truly free, to make that choice.
Okay. Let us get into some feedback as to what we think about this. Annie Kidder, initial reactions to the idea of a voucher system.
That it's worrying, I guess. I think that part of the job of government and all of us, when we think about public good, is kind of balancing, and it's hard, I'm not saying it's easy, balancing the overall kind of collective good with what we need as individuals. So there's that tension there. And when you look at countries that have stronger systems of taking basically public money and spending it on not public institutions, there has been a tendency to divide even more. So there are countries where we've seen, and even in the United States, where there are places where there are vouchers, you end up with the public system losing quite a few students, maybe some stratification in terms of socioeconomic status, but even dividing kids along their differences in a way, so that we're dividing as opposed to bringing together. We're undoing the chance of public education to build social cohesion. But on the other hand, I'm not saying public education is perfect. So it's really important when you're having this conversation not to go, it's perfect the way it is, and we should, everybody should just go to it. And I'm also not judging anybody for saying, I want to send my kid to a private or an independent school, because I think it's also important that we're not going, and you're making a terrible choice for your child.
You don't want the taxpayer to pay for a private education.
Yeah.
Ray, where would you come back on that?
I would say that vouchers look very different in different settings. So there are, even in Canada, if you take all the provinces west of Ontario, there is opportunity for parents to send their children to a school and get some percentage, 70%, I think, in Alberta, 50% in British Columbia, of the per student amount to school. So it's not a pure voucher. There are, those are independent schools. So there are lots of different ways that vouchers look at. There was a study a few years ago looking at 55 countries. We tend often, when we talk about education, look south of the border. I actually think that, looking at Europe, at Denmark, the Netherlands, and a number of those countries are the more valid comparisons. And many of them, Australia as well, have systems that could be described as voucher-type systems. They all vary from each other. Very few of them are pure vouchers in which there are no conditions attached, and often parents have to pay something over and above the voucher to participate in alternative schools.
Well, can I follow up with you on the Netherlands? Because I'm told there that they've been using vouchers for more than 100 years, and as a result, 70% of students there go to privately run schools, which are, of course, supported with public funding because of the vouchers. What's the verdict on how well it's working?
The Netherlands, along with some of the other countries, does very well on international PISA tests and all of the others. So when educational experts look at outcomes, they tend to do well. I think one of the challenges that we have is even when we describe outcomes, what are the outcomes that we're looking for? So quickly we look at just academic outcomes in terms of, number of kids going to university and all of the other. What we at Cardis have been doing for the last few years has been measuring outcomes in Canada and the United States, not just in terms of academic achievement, but also in terms of cultural engagement and spiritual formation. What we have found, and we've used the criteria of the Public Education Act. So we've taken the Education Act, what is education for, and we've measured adult behaviors of those who did not go to public school. And what we're finding is there are strengths and weaknesses, and there's tons of data. Overall, you can make the argument that academically, most of these schools are relatively the same, slightly ahead, but actually are comparable in most cases. In terms of civic engagement, those graduates tend to be more engaged in public life in terms of volunteering, more likely to be refereeing as adults, more likely, their level of donations to their community are much higher.
And these are students who go to religious independent
These
schools.
are all not just religious.
Hang on, I need you to finish the sentence out. They're more likely to do all those things if...
They're more likely to do all of those things as adults. So we are taking a look at 23 to 39-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And we have controlled for social economic status, religious, and all of the other factors. So we're actually comparing apples and apples here.
But they do all those things if they are graduates of a voucher system? Is that what you're saying?
No, of independent schools.
Of independent schools, of which you represent.
Right.
How many?
149.
In the province of Ontario?
Yeah, so
Okay.
there's far more than that, but those are the ones that are part of our association.
Gotcha. Kelly, we got to hear from you on this. Where are you coming from on this issue of whether vouchers are a useful introduction to the education system?
Well, I also tend to be concerned about the ideal of common schooling helping us build a stronger society together. And I'm concerned that vouchers are something that might be something likelier to promote inequality. When we look at the Ontario private school system, there are 400 private schools across Ontario, and there may be some very, very good ones. I think there are. But we know that the quality is much wider in the Ontario private school system, and the Auditor General says that overall achievement is lower on the required grade 10 tests in the private school system, and that reflects sort of a diversity and a lack of control. And I think that we have an unequal system with problems in it, but there is a goal around equity of opportunity, and there are certain constants that we have within the public school system that I don't think we can guarantee in the private sector. And, I think it's of great concern to me when I see the Auditor General reporting that in the case of a quarter of private schools in Ontario, there were serious concerns about the quality of education and the quality of the diplomas being granted.
But surely there would be in the public school system too, wouldn't there?
I don't think so. No.
Not in the same way.
Not in the
the
same
auditor
way.
actually made that point.
The fact of the matter is public schools are not adjudicated inspection-wise in the same manner that private schools are. There's a far more stringent adjudication process for private school secondary school credits than there is in the public schools, so that has to account for that. Just on the other matter too, though, what Annie was talking about cohesion and that type of thing, private schools have been growing. When we chart the growth in the private school sector between 2005 and 2015-16, which is the last data available, private schools have been growing in enrollment in the number of private schools in general, which is actually 1,100 in the province. Wow. Nearly, just on, I think it's 1,044. But those schools and their enrollments are growing, and we're not seeing that division. Parents are still choosing with the financial penalty of full tuition, and they're still choosing those schools because they want what's best for their family, what matches best with what their children need, and nobody knows that better than mom and dad.
But let's understand that 95% of the province's children are still educated in the public school system.
Right.
Is that right?
But to discount private school students and say they are not contributing to the public good, or that this is not a task of educating the public good.
Nobody's saying this.
Okay,
Nobody's saying that.
No. I think that's really, really, really important that it's, and again, that's why it's not about judging anybody who's wants to send their kids to private school or finds the school that they're supposed to be sending their child to wanting in some ways. That's and again, it's not to say it's perfect, but I think if we look at the international evidence and we look at the OECD's looked at this a lot. That they still find that having a system where there are vouchers or where there's public expenditure on private schools or independent schools, it doesn't make all the schools better, because that is one of the arguments for them. And also that still, when you control for socioeconomic status, even though I think that study is really interesting about what the other factors are, which we don't look at in the public system, and we should, when you control for socioeconomic status, they are no better than public schools, and that there is a stratification. And that's the part that we have to take into account.
Can I was going to say, if we take parents who send their kids to private schools in Ontario, there was a study a couple of years ago, if we take away the 5% at the very top, and there are no doubt, 16% of independent, private schools in Ontario are the elite schools, the Upper Canada colleges, the Havergales. The remaining 95% of parents who send their kids to independent schools in Ontario have a lower average family income than the average of Ontario.
That's right.
And yet they are choosing to spend.
They are choosing to spend. My dad is an immigrant, never earned more than $17 in his life, spent 26 years of Christian school tuition, at times 25 to 30% of his salary. That represented, and that was religiously motivated. Now, of the schools in Ontario, only 47% are religiously defined. You also have specialty schools, the Montessoris, the athletic.
But let me get at this, because what I hear underlying a lot of what is happening at this table here is that if we gave parents the choice, because we took out financial need out of the equation, if everybody had a voucher to go to whatever school they wanted to, the assumption would be that everybody would leave the public school system and go into the private system.
You just have to look at the other jurisdictions around the world to find that hasn't happened. Even with partial voucher programs, that hasn't happened. The public school continues to thrive, and in some cases, arguably, can do better, because the healthy dose of competition that provides actually rises the tide for all the
Can
boats.
I jump in on that on that exact point? Because that's one of the arguments I would make, that this is about public education, and I think public education shouldn't be defined by who delivers the education. Right. Education is education for the public good, regardless of which vehicle. And there are different vehicles that are suitable for different families and different students. At the Shapiro Commission in 1985, Dalton McGuinty Sr., father of the premier, testified at that commission that it was healthy and necessary for the public schools to have the independent school sector as a comparator sector, and that would drive excellence in public education.
But I think the problem with that, in all the stuff I've read, and maybe you just read the things you want to, but one of the things I've read is the OECD, which is not exactly your screaming lefty whatever association, is that they say the evidence is, there is not evidence there that that's true, that the healthy competition makes the public education system better. Because it's the same in the United States with charter schools and with vouchers. It's like there'll be these bastions of experiment, and there are really good, there are examples of great ones. They'll do that work to try things out and be pilots, and that will shift to the public education system, but it actually doesn't. That doesn't seem to be the case.
Kelly, can I get you on that?
Well,
obviously
I think an interesting case to look at might be Sweden, right? Because Sweden's a case where they moved to vouchers in about 1992, and about 20% of schools are free schools, which are schools that kids go to. And in Sweden, they've been very careful to try and not allow co-payments, which really stratify people economically. And when they adopted that policy, they were in the top 5 of countries in the global PISA rankings, which are the OECD's
PISA are these test scores.
The test scores that are done globally.
Independent student assessment.
So when it started, they were in the top 5. They've dropped out of the top 20 over that period of time. It's not simple causation, but it's been one of the major policy shifts. It's been quite bad for academic achievement overall in the country. It has not fomented a lot of.
But the opposite is true in Australia.
Which is what?
Which is the same scenario where parents are allowed to send their children to any school they want, and they get partial. It depends where you are in Australia.
The parents don't get the funding.
The point is right. But the point is that
vouchers.
But it's a type of voucher system. Whether the money goes to parents or whether it goes to schools.
Vouchers
I think
is me taking my tax money and spending it. I think vouchers are different. So Alberta, BC, other provinces do partly fund private schools, but it's not a voucher. It's they fund the school.
And I would.
Sorry, and I interrupted
But the
you
point
on
is that Australia, the scenario is exactly opposite to what you described. So can you make a case for that? I would say
I don't think it is exactly the opposite. I mean, in Australia, the division is very, very big between, because it is, there's actually, you pay part of the money.
schools.
So the division along socioeconomic lines in Australia is enormous because the government funds private schools.
There's two. There are various studies out there. I was in prepping for the show. I looked at a study of 55 countries, and it tried to make the claim that for every whatever percent of increase in independent schools, you had a 1.4% increase in PISA scores. I'm sure you can put one study other. It's a very politicized, and we need to recognize, as you point out quite rightly. I don't think the pure voucher system hardly exists in the world. In almost every case, what we are talking about is, do parents have a realistic choice as to where to send their school? Now, in some jurisdictions, that happens within the public system.
Do they in the province of Ontario?
I would argue most don't. I would think that most families in Ontario, it's interesting, when they make their real estate choices, even in the public schools, there is inequality along the way. There's no doubt that that postal codes and which school is associated with that school in a city is how parents make real estate choices.
Can I put this to you, Kelly? In the province of Ontario right now, you have your choice, if you're a Catholic, of going to a publicly funded secular school system, a publicly funded religious school system. If you're French, you have the choice of a publicly funded French school system. So there does seem to be some choice in Ontario right now.
There's choice in systems, and in cities, there's tremendous choice in schools. I mean, I'm the parent of kids at just that prime age. I have a 12 and a 15-year-old. We went to 6 different schools to choose which school would be the best fit for my child.
All publicly funded?
In fact, the public secular English system. There was a full range of choices of schools within the public system. I very much doubt my daughter will wind up at the same school as my son, and I'm happy with the one my son's at. But they're different people, they might want a different fit, and that is absolutely something that's been a huge driver. In the Toronto District School Board alone, there's half the schools have some kind of specialized program. Right? There's a lot of variation.
Talk to us about choice.
It's not a full range of choice. So I'm surprised, I don't think you can use those words. You've got parents who have children with special needs who increasingly fall through the cracks of the public system just because of the circumstances there. They're looking for something very specialized. You have parents whose children respond to different types of educational delivery, different pedagogy. Waldorf, Montessori, they were already mentioned, but we also have schools that focus on particular subject areas. They're art schools or science schools, STEM schools, or they're sports schools. We have an increasing number of sports schools in the province of Ontario, but it's not the full range of choice, and it's not all around the province.
And of course, other religions as well.
Well, there's tons of faith-based schools, all different types.
Well, speaking of which, let's do just a bit of the history here, shall we? And we won't go back to Confederation, but let's go back, 30-some years and talk about why education is always controversial in the province of Ontario. Sheldon, I'm on page 2. Let's bring this graphic up. In 1985, David Peterson's minority Liberal government, with support from Bob Rae's NDP, extended public funding for the Roman Catholic separate school system to the end of high school. Previously, funding only went to the end of grade 10. In 2001, the majority PC government of Mike Harris brought in the Equity in Education Tax Credit, which offered tax breaks to parents who wanted to send their kids to independent or religious schools. That was canceled 2 years later by Dalton McGuinty's Liberal government. In 2007, the then PC leader, now the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory, ran on a policy of offering public funding to eligible faith-based schools. He, of course, didn't win that election, and so the policy never happened. And also in 2007, for the first time, the Ontario Greens ran on a platform plank of defunding the Catholic school system and unifying the public and separate school boards under a single governance system. And of course, because the Greens didn't win, that hasn't happened either. The question that emerges, I think, from all of this, or at least one question that does, has education become so toxic, the mix of education and politics, and in some cases religion, so difficult that every subsequent government has been spooked away from touching educational reform in a significant way?
Oh, Well, I don't think it's, I hate to use toxic and education in the same sentence even.
And yet I just did.
I know. But I think there is a real problem in the kind of political football of education, or using public education, where again, 2 million children are, as a kind of way to push forward your ideology. So I'd rather go back to, for me, it's thinking about what are we doing in our public education system and what do we need to be doing. And the study that was done that looked at the civic engagement of kids when they're adults, and we need more of that. So it was really interesting, that study, and a valid, important piece of information, because I want to know then, what is the thing that's done in, and I did think it was mostly religious schools, and I'm obviously wrong about that, but what is the thing there that's making a difference in terms of the long-term impact? Because right now, we have a few things in our kind of basket of what we can look at. Mostly their test scores, then there's the socioeconomic status, and there's graduation rates. But looking at what do we need to be doing in the public education system in order to make sure we're graduating citizens who are engaged, who have a sense of connectedness, a sense of
So
responsibility.
if you read more into that study,
Yeah.
you will find that one of the reasons they cite for that increase in civic engagement is because parents are more greatly involved in the education of their children, more directly involved. And I think one of the difficulties in the public school system, a lot of the times when I take phone calls from parents who are looking for an alternative type of school, they're frustrated with the current school they're in, likely a public school, because they don't have any say, they don't have any involvement, they can't be involved in a way that they would like to be involved. So they're choosing a private school where that will increase. And according to that same study, that turns into greater civic engagement, greater cultural engagement down the line.
Let me try this with Ray. Let me try this.
Okay.
If a voucher system were in place, meaning here's my check for $10,000 from the government of Ontario, and I can spend this at a public school system as I have right now, or I can go to a private system, anything like that. Right now, the public school system's got to take everybody. They got to find a spot for everybody. If you're going to take a voucher representing taxpayers' dollars, would private schools have to take everybody as well?
Probably.
Yeah.
Why probably and not definitely?
I would say there are a host of things even now in the system. So there are 138,000 students in Ontario, 13,200 per student cost average. So arguably right now,
In independent schools.
no, the public school cost per student is 13,200. So we take that 138,000, that's $1.8 billion. So right now, the public school, if every independent school would close tomorrow, we would have 138,000 more spaces needed in the public system, and it would cost us $1.8 billion.
They'd have to be found.
Annually.
They would have to
Yeah.
be found.
But of course, that's not going to happen. So
That's
it's a
not
bit
going to
of
happen.
a,
In a similar way, I don't think the other side of a pure going from where we are today to the pure voucher is a realistic going to happen tomorrow either.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I would take a look at the Ontario situation, where not only do you not have the funding, you have to pay to register the school. You have to pay for you need the inspections, but you have to pay for those inspections. You have to, all the services that are part of the public
But we're getting off the path here. The question focuses on whether or not, because private schools are allowed to cherry pick who they want to have and who they don't want to have right now, whether that
They
gives
don't
them,
cherry pick. I think that's not right, the descriptor.
They certainly do.
No, they certainly don't cherry pick. What they do is they try to match families with schools. They try to assist parents in choosing what is the best for their child. I have actually been in some of our schools and heard our administrators encourage a parent and say, I'm not sure this is the best school for you, but maybe you want to try this school or that school, and they make recommendations. Because the goal is to make sure that the child gets the best educational support that it
but there are admission tests. You got to pass an admission test.
No,
For
there
some
aren't
of them.
admission. Well, yeah, but I think that would be
for
more.
most
No, there aren't.
religious schools
No,
and all
there
the rest,
actually
there are
aren't.
not. There are none.
I would say the only place there are admissions tests was in the 15% of
the
the
elite
elite
schools.
established
If
schools.
half
But
the
in the
schools are
schools in our
religious.
association, no.
Yeah. Right.
There are definitely placement protocols with respect to where's the best place in the school to put this student, but there are not tests.
But let me jump forward. My colleague Michael Van Pelt put out a paper last week in which we made the suggestion that if it was an objective of provincial policy to double or triple, so instead of 5% independent schools, let's say we put an objective in which there was 10 or 15%. There's clear evidence that there needs to be enough critical mass, so there are the independent school associations and some of the buying and all the things for that market to do well. Take British Columbia, which is at 13.2% today. Arguably, the pressures at that level would create a competitive environment in which innovation could happen in independent schools. And if we viewed all of these schools as part of a public system for the public good, and we had a spirit of learning from each other, of innovation, of learning from each other, I think, number one, parental choice would be honored, there'd be more diversity, and we'd have a much more vibrant culture of education for the public good that would benefit every citizen of Ontario.
Kelly, let me read this quote to you. Jonathan Kozol's a prominent public school, he is a school reform thinker in the States, former public school teacher too. He called vouchers the single worst, most dangerous idea to have entered education discourse in my adult life. There's nothing equivocal about that. What's so dangerous about trying vouchers?
Well, there's a couple things that I think are dangerous. First of all, I don't think, at this point, I think there's really a lot of room to challenge the admissions processes of at least some schools on the basis of human rights violations. Kids with learning disabilities routinely being turned away from some schools. I feel concerned about public dollars going to schools where parents are maybe choosing their kids don't learn about science or the Charter of Rights. That worries me. And I think that fundamentally they're a driver of inequality. And the idea of parents having full choice of their child's school is very appealing, but the reality in places like Chile is actually the schools are choosing the kids. So it gives authority in a very different way than the sort of idealistic, let's just choose our own thing. And ultimately, I think there's kind of a classic political science distinction between voice and exit. I think schools can do better at giving parents more voice and more say within the context of collective agreements and administrative rules around safety and human rights. That's something there's room for improve on, but I believe deeply that voice is more powerful as an engine of change than exit. And that if we want a strong system where every kid learns some science and some deep infusion of the basic democratic values of our society, then I think we need to really be committed to a public system that's the first point of entry. And I think there's been drivers within the public system. I mean, of powerful, committed parents in the public system who have worked to make it a better system for all of us. Compare the reserve schools. Where the parents didn't have power. You don't want a leftover
Let's take a look at
But
where
it's
we're heading.
interesting that you're talking about reserve schools because reserve schools are actually considered independent by the province of Ontario. They're not considered part of the public system. I've got three Native Canadian schools in my association, and they receive support from us. So I just don't think that.
They may be outside they're administered by the federal government too.
They're an example of a leftover system where the parents don't have very much power.
But they're funded federally and they're adjudicated provincially.
Okay, Ray, you wanted to make the point.
Yeah, I would. OISE every year does
It's the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education.
Does an annual survey and has since '78 or whatever. It asked the Canadian public to give a grade. We've gone down. Only 8% of Ontarians give an A to the public school system. There are some serious concerns in terms of our education as a whole. And I don't think this is about independent is better than public and public. There are good and bad schools in every one of those systems. And we can cherry pick one example or the other. I think what needs to drive this discussion is to say, okay, what are the foundations? And I think parental input and choice and involvement at a school level is one of the drivers. And one of the ways that happens, independent schools, because today they require tuition and all the rest, they're market-driven in terms of a sensitivity. If you're the administrator of an independent school, you account to a board of parents, and you're looking at enrollment for next year, and there is a very real market mechanism to keep you responsible to your constituency.
Annie, go ahead.
And this is about this is about the parent piece, and I think parents are wonderful. I am a parent. I'm not, denigrating parents at all. But I think that the problem with sort of equating some kind of sort of causal thing, that what we need is a private system or more choice in a way to make the public system better. I don't think there's any evidence of that. And we are an organization that is fighting hard to think about, what is the purpose, what's the future of public education, and how does it need to change? And I think that the thing that's important about the parent piece in this is that overall, when you look internationally, it's the parents with the capacity to choose who choose, first of all. So you've already got a parent who knows enough about the system, is thinking about it in a certain way. And so then so parents who don't have the capacity to choose for whatever reason, tough luck on them and their kids. And I think it shouldn't be like that. And I think parents are incredibly important, but not necessarily experts either. And that we have to make sure that we are fighting to support, change, alter, evolve, and it's not very easy to evolve, I'll definitely give it that, the public system so that children can go to it no matter what their parents' way of thinking is in a way, so that we're making sure that they're educated very, very well.
Okay, let me read this if I can.
And I think that this takes away, in a way, from what we need to be doing in the public education
Let me read
system.
this quote. I get emails from time to time from a fella who doesn't want his name mentioned, but he's got a point of view. Let's put it that way. Sheldon, bring up the graphic if you would. We have an educational system, he writes, that serves the interests of mediocre teachers, the good ones would get raises, their unions, a massive bureaucracy, and the politicians that seek their votes. Singapore was a third world country when you were born, meaning me, and it has passed Canada in every international comparison. Vouchers have introduced competition into education in Sweden, and the result has been that even the traditional public schools have picked up their socks because of competition from privatized, publicly funded with vouchers, schools. Question: are things so good in the province of Ontario today that vouchers aren't worth trying?
I think they aren't worth trying.
Yeah.
I think it's important to look at more than a popularity contest when we're assessing how our school system's doing. And it's easy to put down your own school or put down the school system here. But by most international measures, Ontario is a very successful school system, which needs to do better. And there's lots of room for excelling, I think. I'm concerned, the experience in Chile has been that once you start down the path, it is one that it's hard to reverse when the government, or in Sweden, where the government's decided this isn't working, you start building constituencies.
They did decide in Chile and Sweden, oops,
they both
this was
wanted
a bad
to fix
idea.
it, and they found it hard to fix.
Yeah,
so it's
done.
not one of those little experiments that
Well, let me try
doesn't
this.
have
I got a
some
minute left here. I got a
permanent
minute.
effects.
Barb, this for you. The Ford government has certainly indicated that it is prepared to tick some people off when they think they're right and they think other people are wrong. I think of the debate over how to make Toronto City Council smaller. Environmentalists, French language service supporters, universities, basic income proponents, they've made a lot of decisions that have angered a lot of people. Can you imagine Premier Ford allowing some experimentation on this and really ticking off a lot of people in the public education system?
There is a province-wide education consultation going on, and parents and stakeholders are being encouraged to participate in that consultation and to let the government know what they feel is needed in the education system. Independent school parents are going to be filling that out too. They're part of this landscape as well. They're part of the province with respect to the fact that they're voters. So yeah, they're going to give their say as well. And I'm sure some of them are going to share those ideas. You look at the education budgets, every year since 1973, we're spending more and more on education, and we're seeing fewer and less outcomes. We're behind Alberta, we're behind BC in many of the test scorings.
I know you want to continue this, but we got to go.
Okay, so I think
time.
Doug Ford is interested in innovating. He's not interested in tinkering with education.
We shall see. I want to thank everybody for coming into TVO tonight. I think we all know a lot better 35 minutes later than we did 35 minutes ago about what vouchers are all about and whether it's a good or a bad thing. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.